Hello friends, this week's Ecstatic Buddhist Discourse is on the religious experience, and what defines a mystic, of course, is their religious experiences. And every religion has its mystics, and those mystics define their religious experience using various terms. And those terms vary from culture to culture because we're going from language to language. So if we look at the Christian mystics, they typically define their religious experience excuse me, within the context of contemplation. And by the way, before I get any further, we have to realize that every language has something called language shift in it, meaning that as languages mature or age, the meaning of some terms shifts over time. And the terms that shift most in a language are the abstract terms. And I believe the reason why the meaning of these terms shift over time is because people have trouble understanding those abstract concepts. And among the most abstract concepts in any culture are the religious experience. And the reason why is there are really very few mystics who come along, and in most cases, most of the mystics are marginalized, and we never hear from them. We only hear from a very few. So, among the handful of Christian mystics, such as Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, they used a term called contemplation as the overarching term for the religious experience. And then Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross defined their religious experience in ecstatic terms, such as bliss, joy, and ecstasy, which suggests an altered state of consciousness. Excuse me. So then, if we look at, let's say, the Sufi mystics, and most notably that would be Jalaluddin Rumi and Al-Hallaj and a few others, they would have used the term fanna, and fanna means annihilation, and and there's actually Ibn al-Arabi talked about 8 stages of fanna. And by the way, let's go back to Teresa of Avila. Her interior castle had 7 rooms, and I believe that those 7 rooms in that interior castle were a reference to 7 stages of contemplation or religious ecstasy. So in Sufism, which is mystical Islam, there's a concept of the religious experience, and they use the term fanna, and they define it in ecstatic terms. As a matter of fact, if we read, let's say, Teresa of Avila's descriptions of her religious experiences, and we read Rumi's descriptions, those descriptions are remarkably similar. So we can conclude that the Christian mystics' use of the term contemplation is consistent with the Islamic mystics' use of the term fanna. So now if we go to mystical Sikhism, and that would be most notably in Kabir. Kabir used the term loc, L-O-C is how we Romanize it. And he referred to 8 stages of spiritual ecstasy, or 8 locs. And that term loc, by the way, is etymologically related to our term location, so or loci. So these locs or loci or locations are defined by him in 8 stages, and I think perhaps the English term domain probably is a good translation for the term lock. And by the way, he defined his 8 locks in ecstatic terms like bliss, joy, and ecstasy. And if we read Kabir, we see that Kabir's description of his religious experiences are consistent with Rumi's and Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross's. So we can conclude that that lock in a Sikh mystical context is consistent with fanna in Islam or Sufism and contemplation in Christian mysticism. So now we can go to Hinduism, and Patanjali is the most notable person who had a whole chapter on defining samadhi. And his description of samadhi includes ecstatic terms like bliss and joy. And he described basically two classes of samadhi, which I believe are the major classes, in which these 8 stages of samadhi are broken into 2 groups of 4. So from reading Patanjali, we can see that his description is consistent with Kabir, Rumi, and Teresa of Avila. So we can conclude that samadhi is a synonym for contemplation, fanna, and lock. And then if we read other Hindu literature, we find other terms that are used as, let's say, a subset for samadhi, and in fact the term is loca. And loca, of course, is related to Kabir's lock. Kabir was speaking in Punjabi, or teaching in Punjabi. That was his native tongue. Excuse me. The Sanskrit for lock would be loca, and we see that in the particularly in the Bhagavad Gita. Okay, so now let's go to early Buddhism and the discourses of the Buddha, otherwise known as the Sutta Pitaka. We see there samadhi is the overarching concept. Excuse me. The term samadhi is used, and then there's 2 subset terms that break up samadhi into eight stages, with 2 classes. One class is jhana, and I believe that's consistent with the Savikalpa version of samadhi for Patanjali, and then there's a series of 4 samadhi states beyond the 4 jhanas that all end, excuse me, with the suffix ayatana. So I call them the ayatanas. They're erroneously called what is it? They are erroneously called the upper jhanas, but the term jhana is not applied to these upper 4 samadhi states, but the suffix ayatana is in each of those terms. Anyway, so the Buddha talks about 8 stages of samadhi, 4 jhanas and 4 ayatanas, and he describes them in ecstatic terms, and his description is consistent with Patanjali, Kabir, Rumi, and Teresa of Avila. So we can conclude that contemplation is probably a much better translation for the term samadhi and jhana than the standard translation, which would be concentration. Okay, friends, so we can conclude contemplation is a synonym for fanna, which is a synonym for lock, which is a synonym for loca, which is a synonym for samadhi, which is a synonym for jhana. These are terms that are consistent with each other, if we're going to try and translate the religious experiences of a mystic in another language into English, we really should be using the term contemplation. Okay, friends, thank you very much, and have a blissful week.